Everyone is looking for a way to be more sustainable. The challenge is to find ways that are practical and actionable for both industry and for consumers. Without this, sustainability will be often talked about but seldom implemented. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome to A Seat at the Table. Today I'm speaking with David Horlock, Managing Director of Global Food and Retail Supply Chain at the British Standards Institute. David spent 30 years working with companies on organizational resilience and supply chain compliance across a wide range of industries. During that time, he's worked with brands on quality, process, and supply chain behavior issues to help them comply with regulatory, performance, and modern-day consumer requirements. David began his career as an agriculturalist, so you could say he knows the supply chain from the ground up. David will be sharing his perspective on how manufacturers and brands can incorporate sustainability into their total quality equation and bring consumers the products they want in a way that is meaningful. David, thank you for joining us today. When we spoke at lunch, you had so many interesting things to share about product quality, and I think that right now, quality has become such a critical aspect of being able to make a product appealing to consumers. So I wanted to be able to dive into that a bit deeper with you.
Well, thank you, Jane. Pleasure to be here. And yes, it was a very enjoyable lunch. And yes, quality is a constantly changing definition all the time.
True. So if you're looking at quality right now, what are you looking for in particular? I mean, how would you be defining that? I know that's a very big question.
Well, that's a really good question because, years ago, product quality was about the physical attributes of a product. Was it fit for purpose and did it fulfill the requirements that was intended? And the first standards that ever came out in the world, they were sort of product standards. They were guidelines, whether it was a food standard or a textile standard or a standard for building or construction products. They were what we call product specifications. Then we moved to process specification. So can you make that product consistently? Can you make it repeatably? Can you make it right first time? Reduce defects? So that was process quality. So we got product quality, process quality. Now we have what we call behavior quality. What is the behavior in that supply chain behind the product? So it's not just about getting the product right and the process right, but it's about the behavior in the supply chain. Has the supply chain, is it free of human trafficking? Is the supply chain being responsible for the environment? In the garment textile area, it's like azo dyes and mills, and are these chemicals registered? Are they REACH and ROSE compliant? Do they have wastewater treatment plants? Are they going into rivers and damaging ecosystems? How was the cotton produced? The people around the cotton, the ecosystem. There's a whole host of aspects. So, I always say today, if you're going to survive in the future, you've got to get product quality right, you've got to get process quality right, and you get behavior quality right.
Wow, that's a lot.
Well, it is. You don't get into trouble today for making a bad T-shirt, do you? I mean, you can reinvent the product, you can take it to market again, but if you're associated with a bad environmental issue, a human rights issue in your supply chain, that can have massive consequences to your brand. Because we say, beyond quality is trust.
Right.
And once you reach trust, what do you have?
Well, I think that's just it. I think that, initially when brands got started as being a brand, it was really about giving the consumer a sense of trust in that product. It was a name you can trust.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you look at, the fast-moving consumer industry, if you look at Coca-Cola, for instance, one of the largest beverage companies in the world, and you added up their assets, 20, 30 years ago, you would have been counting land and buildings and infrastructure. Today, they outsource a lot of that through license agreements. So it's an $80 billion brand with a $180 billion supply chain. Take Nike, same thing. The name and the values in the brand, the supply chain is outsourced, right? That's why the brand and the name and the behavior around the brand is so important today.
Yeah, that's very important. And I think that to a great extent in the past, let's say 10 to 20 years, that's been forgotten in pursuit of price. So people have thought, well, if we have a famous name, that's good enough. And then little by little, as quality was eroded, consumers don't have that same trust in these brands anymore. And that opens them up to a lot of competition.
Well, that's right, Jane. And, the complexity of supply chains. I mean, if you go back years ago, most developing OECD countries in the world were self-sufficient. So the supply chains were, within 100, 150 kilometers of the factory.
Mm.
You put the handshake into business. People knew who they were dealing with. You were operating in environments where there was good governance. Relationships were established. Raw material suppliers were known. And then we go to the world of globalization, where capital flows, where labor is cheap. So we're going into developing countries that don't have the same maturity in terms of institutions, infrastructure, enforcement of human rights, labor laws, environmental compliance. So we find ourselves in supply chains that are 5,000 miles away, operating in high-risk environments where the governance and enforcement isn't the same, and it changes the whole picture, right? And that creates a totally different type of risk altogether. And that's why I say, we have to go back to the definition of what a supplier is. And I think we've lost that definition.
I think that's important, and you had touched upon that the last time we spoke, saying that supply chains have become so sprawling that people really think they know their supply chain, but actually, if you really, got down to it and really did an in-depth audit, you'd find it might be quite different than what oftentimes the buyer thinks.
I've been in the supply chain business, pre-qualifying factories for global brands and retailers for the last 30 years, and I can tell you that the definition of supplier in many instances is the invoicing entity. If you want to know your supplier, you go to the accounts department and say, print out a list of our suppliers. But an invoicing entity is not necessarily the real factory with real people, with real processes that are making your products. You have a whole host of intermediaries, agents, domestic importers, wholesalers. So understanding who your real supplier is making your product is critically important, ensuring that you know who they are, where they are, can they be trusted, and are they adhering to your corporate values. Now, from aerospace through to electronics, through to garments, through to retail, I can tell you we're not there yet, because we just keep switching to lower price. We go for intermediaries, we go for agents, there's subcontracting. It is getting a lot better, Jane, and I think it's a lot of that's being driven by the social media. And the fact that if you look at supply chain incidences, they've gone up around 200% since the year 2000. And the incidences, average incidence around 20 million, 20% of them around 200 million.
Wow.
And most of these have been caused purely and simply because of the complexity of social media.
Mm.
You can't hide it anymore. It's there for all to see, and that is changing. So as the world's getting more complicated, supply chains getting a lot longer, but then we have social media now is requiring greater sort of transparency and visibility. And the new generation of consumers, they want to know or be able to know where it comes from, impact on the environment, who's making it. So we got sort of opposing forces there, if you know what I mean. We got complexity and speed, and then another one, we have transparency as well.
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, when you do something right, no one will talk about it, but when something goes wrong, everyone will jump all over it. So it'll, like you said, be all over social media and get a tremendous amplification.
And it's also very there's a lot of conflict in organizations as well, because everybody's trying to do the right thing in intent, and sometimes these things just happen because we don't know that we don't know.
Right.
If you leave everything to the legal guys, you'd end up with empty supermarket shelves. If you left it with procurement and you just went for cheapest price, you'd end up in prison. So I suppose it's like anything, you need balance, and balance in the middle is getting procurement with legal with quality
Mm.
to determine collectively what are our corporate values and what are the prerequisites of supply. What are the things that we must have in place, irrespective of just price alone? Because, price is a huge economic driver, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
And brand reputation is something that may happen and it may not happen. So it has no, additional cost to prevent that. It has no value until you have a train crash.
Right.
It's like fire insurance has no value until you have a fire. So these things are always very hard to justify because they're nice to haves, not necessarily must haves.
Right, exactly.
So that's why alignment of corporate values and specifying what are the minimum requirements we need for a supplier. So supplier risk assessment is really important to say these are the prerequisites for onboarding a supplier. We need to know who they are, where they are, and we've visited them because we want to know them. And that's more important if it's like a private label product, or it's a high risk product, or it's a handmade product that's being made in a developing country where wages are low because we know, the risk is higher. It may be products which are for infants and immunocompromised because it's high risk. It may be based on dollar spend. So, risk means different things to different people. Some people it's economic value, some it's intended use of the product, some it's the way the product's made, some it's the country that it's manufactured in. But you can define your own risk matrix to determine that.
Right. So once you define your risk matrix, how do you then go back and detangle this kind of a very complex and sprawling supply chain, particularly that we have, in the garment industry? I think it's one of the most complex supply chains. There's so many different inputs. So what would be how could someone in a practical way implement this in their company?
Well, we have companies that do this, and some of them do it very well where legal, procurement and QA have shared values and prerequisites which determine what has to be done in terms of onboarding suppliers, what subcontracting can be done, and how that is actually done. There are some companies that just go through agents, intermediaries, and just hope for the best. And usually things work out well, but if people are overworked and the factories don't have the capacity, you have supply chain shifting to subcontracting where it shouldn't go. You have changes in raw material supply. You have fluctuations in currency. You have shortages in raw materials, and that creates behaviour and risk and things which are somewhat sort of undesirable. But it's, being on top of these things and knowing your suppliers, knowing your factories, and building lasting relationships, right? And reduce the churning that's going on in those supply chains.
Right. I think that you're right. Part of that, with regard to apparel, certainly has been people for so many years chasing price, which meant switching suppliers a lot, which made it more difficult to vet new suppliers.
Well, we say that price is the most important thing because everything is sold with a discount. There's come here, it's a discount. So we create a supply chain where we're running on a razor blade. I mean, I'm a consumer. I never asked for price. I was told that price was important,
right?
But I never asked for price. I've been educated and indoctrinated that price was the most important thing. So you then go and chase price at all costs. But we say, what's the difference between a $5 bottle of wine and a $100 bottle of wine or $20 bottle of wine? It's a meaning. It's a meaning behind, and we say in consumption equals pleasure. Consumption equals pleasure. Now, years ago, when we only spent around, when we spent 50-60% of our disposable income on food and consumer goods, these items were like we ate and we dressed for survival, right? Today, it's only 20% of our income, so we consume for pleasure. So if like I say, food equals pleasure, or you could say garments, which is consumption, or fashion equals pleasure, and pleasure equals taste or performance, meaning, the meaning behind the product, and trust. And if that is the case, how do you put that meaning and how do you put that trust into your product and into your supply chain? And some brands are doing just absolutely amazing things, right? Absolutely amazing things, but they're not good at telling their supply chain story. And I'm saying if you don't go and tell your supply chain story and have that as a value add and actually build your brand around all the good things you're doing in terms of human rights and environment and biodiversity and ecology and sustainability and the United nation's 17 sustainability development goals and wrap that packaging and that meaning behind your product, somebody will tell your story for you, and they'll usually come in and tell you that story when you have your train crash or something that goes wrong. And it's not going to be an incident which is representative of your organization. It's just an isolated incident. It's a train crash, and the media are all over it.
Right.
Right. So I have a thing called a CEO stress test, where I say, be ready for the train crash. And those questions that you dream about, that you never want. And question number one is, how many suppliers do you have?
Right.
And question number two is, how many are direct and how many are indirect? And question number three is, how many you visited? And question number four is, how do they adhere to your corporate values and what are the issues? And if you say nothing, no one will believe you. So the next question is, what are you doing about improving it? And I think if you have answers to those, you have a plausible answer that you're engaged, you're committed, you have standards, you monitor it, you know what's happening, you know what the issues are, and you're building capacity within your supply chains to bring these people up to speed.
Right, right.
And it's a nice story. Tell people about it, because as I say, if you don't tell your supply chain story, someone will tell it for you.
Yeah, that's very true, especially when it's a negative story, as you were saying.
So there's a lot of lovely stuff happening out there. I mean, if I go and look at factories and facilities in Asia compared to 30 years ago, I mean, they're fantastic. And I think a lot of that is because of the international brands and retailers that have been out there and building capacities in these facilities. And if you go and look at an export facility, you'll generally see they have better infrastructure, better roads, better pay, better dormitory facilities, better bathrooms, canteens. I mean, these facilities are a lot better, and a lot of that has been driven by the international brands and retailers, so they should be congratulated for that. They've done a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, there definitely has been very big improvements. I think that beyond the big picture, which is, of course, the upstream side of things that you've been talking about just now, there's also a bit more downstream, which is quality from a consumer-facing point of view. And usually the first thing that consumers see once they get beyond the design and, the look, the color, the silhouette and so forth is hand feel. And hand feel has become a very big criteria in recent years. People want a very soft hand feel. And you were talking about the last time we were speaking about the quality in terms of fiber and why certain fibers are itchy or why you're getting pilling and things like that. So could you perhaps address that? I know that's a bit more granular, but if you could touch on that.
Okay. Well, I used to be an agronomist and I'm an animal production specialist. So I started life in terms of understanding the physiology of how fibers grew, whether it was animals or crops or whatever. And then I saw in those days, buyers from brands, they would go direct to the farm and they would feel those fibers and they'd look at the length and the tensile strength and they'd buy directly and they would commission scour and they'd make these beautiful fabrics, which were inexpensive brands. I mean, there was a story behind these products. And I suppose in those era, if I look at my father, he probably had, 2 or 3 suits for his life. People bought a tie, they bought a suit, and they wore that all their life. Nowadays we have this throwaway society where we buy something for several seasons and we throw it away. So we lost that focus on quality. We lost the focus on the brand and the story and the meaning behind the product. And we've lost a generation of people that understand the supply chains. From farm to fork or from paddock to cloth. So let me give you an example. Everyone says, let's go for organic cotton. You really want to go for organic cotton? Are we really sure that organic cotton is the best way? Do we know that only 10% of land in the world we can actually use organic agriculture? I mean, it's not going to be able to produce enough. The next thing you have is that you got dryland cotton, you got irrigated cotton. So if you got irrigated cotton and you got plenty of water there, you get equal growth of cell elongation, cell division, and you got continuity in growth. You end up with nice long fibers, strong fibers. You put them in the ginning and the spinning process and you produce beautiful yarns. Right? If you go for dryland organic cotton and you have moisture period of stress, you have problems with fiber length and fiber strength, which means fibers break. They don't perform as well. You can't run your looms as quick. Your fabric quality is not as good. I mean, that's just one example. If you go and look at wool, the number one reason why people don't wear wool is because it itches and it scratches. And it was actually Dr. Dieter Plake from the CSIRO in Australia that identified that wool prickle is a mechanical force. It's not an allergy that people have. When I was young at boarding school, we wore these football jumpers and these dressing gowns and these army-style sort of blankets. It was like, being in a brambury bush, I mean, it was so prickly. But what he identified is that wool prickle is caused by a fibre greater than 30 micron, forcing sufficient pressure on the skin without buckling to excite the pain receptors.
Oh, really? Wow.
And for a fibre to cause prickle, generally speaking, it needs more than 5% of fibres greater than 30 micron. Right? So what happens is that you could start off with a perfectly prickle-free fleece or a lot of wool. You put it into the scouring operation. You put it into the top-making operation. And the blender comes in there and he buys this, long 3am wool. It's fine. And he mixes it with some New Zealand carpet wool or some wool from Russia or another top. Because this one's 1,300 cents a kilo. This other coarse wool is 200 cents per kilo.
So they blend it down to save money.
They blend it down to make money because you convert the $2 stuff to $13 stuff.
Right.
So you only put a bit in, but if you put in too much, all of a sudden you've taken this beautiful fabric that's got more than 5% of fibres greater than 30 micron and you cause prickle.
Mm.
Now, fine wool could have the same feeling as cashmere and mohair. Now, this is unique to wool fibre. So we're destroying a lot of value because we're not understanding, and because we're not understanding, we're not going back to source. And if we go back to source, we can buy from source. We can collect that wool that has been lovingly prepared by the growers and the farmers and the wool classes, and then we put it into bales, and then we segregate that, and we commission scour, we commission top make, and we go through and we make beautiful fabrics that you can make lingerie and all sorts of stuff. But no, we have the traders in there that are blending. Mm. So that's on the fabric feel one, right? There's a science to it, Jane, and if you understand it, and the techies understand, and the designers understand it, well, then you could go back and you can actually control that.
Right.
The other one is pilling.
Yes, that's a very big issue.
So you go into these textile labs, you see the pilling machines where they just got these little round pads, and they go round and round in circles on this fabric, right, hour after hour after hour, to see whether if there's any loose fibres in that fabric that causes those little balls. Mm. Now, what happens when you make a top and you make a garment? You're spinning, right? You're spinning from fibres.
Right.
If you get a fleece that's, say, 6 centimeters long, it's got nice long fibers, right? But if you go and blend that with what they call locks, so a lock is like a second cut. When somebody shears a sheep, you take the first shearing and you've left 1 or 2 centimeters on that animal, and you take the comb and you shear it again. That's called a lock. Or you've got the bits down the feet.
Right.
So that short wool is blended with the long wool, and that causes those short fibers. So those short fibers with wearing, what happens? They peel, and that's where all those little balls come from.
Right. Interesting.
Now, you can prevent that happen by specifying that the scouring of the wool that you're going to purchase and the top making is from one specific specification, and you buy that specification.
Right.
So you don't let the master blenders go in there and blend to a price.
Right.
Very, very complicated, Jane. I did a report for the Australian Wool Corporation about 25 years ago looking at the supply chain, and I ended up calling it the spaghetti junction because it was like a bowl of spaghetti where everything went, and it was very hard to get, consumer needs and wants and requirements, and somebody that understood enough about the whole industry to go right down at farm level and give them what they want, pay it, tell the story, the meaning behind the product. And I don't know if the economics would allow that, whether it would be economical, because people may be not prepared to pay the premium for something of that value. But I think there's a beautiful story there to be told.
Well, that's just it. I think that if the consumer is educated and understands why the price is more, you have a better chance of them paying more. When they just see two garments that at first glance look the same and one is more expensive, it's very difficult for them to justify, well, why should I spend more money? Yes, especially exactly. When previously they had bought things and had a bad experience. So I think that there's a lot of communication that needs to take place between a brand or a retailer and the consumer, because I think if people see that, oh, if I spend more money for this, it'll last a long time, the feel will remain nice, I think that they may be more compelled to spend.
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities there for niche and for brands to look at that. And I think I have a 21-year-old daughter, and I think, she went through that phase, like that whole generation where they would just buy and buy and buy because it was fashionable once or twice, throw it away. And I think there's an element of there's a number of that now that are looking at sort of minimalism and just questioning all this stuff.
That's right.
Just
Yeah.
slow the world down. Don't put me in a position where I've got to keep upgrading and buying all the time. Maybe less is more, and maybe I want to buy less items, but with greater meaning and greater quality that I can connect my personality with. And I think that's an enormous opportunity for retailers just to slow down.
Well, you're absolutely right about that, because I think that retail lags consumer demand. Even though, I think that in the past, retail led consumer demand. The fashion dictated, so to speak, right? Retailers would tell you, right? The media would tell you, this is in, this is what you need to have. Nowadays, consumers, as you were pointing out, make up their own mind and decide what they want. And everyone doesn't want the same thing. They're much more mindful. People will do some research on things and think about, do I really want this or not? So consumers are very much, downshifting, so to speak. Minimalism, downsizing, fewer and better, less is more. I mean, you've heard all the, the expressions. But that's where it's going.
I see it in myself. I see it in my family. I see it in my, children's friends, so this is something that, well, certainly in the developed world, right? Then we have the developing world all making the same, following the same sort of patterns that we did. So I'm not saying it's, homogeneous, but there's different markets and there's different trends. And I think there's a lovely opportunity there for, as I say, consumption equals pleasure, and pleasure is, meaning, trust, and the fit for purpose. If it's food, it's taste, and if it's a garment product, it's sort of meeting the expectations.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that we can see it, and we've been tracking this through the work that we do at Inside Fashion, actually since about, I would say, the early 2000s. Maybe around 2005, if I can place an actual date on it, of seeing that people started to think about this. They weren't actually acting upon it, but there was conversation about that. And then we could see little by little by little. And as, we talked to people and, meeting with people from big brands, from smaller brands, we could see a lot of the up-and-coming indie brands and so forth were addressing this fewer and better and, quality oriented, because they were reaching more of a narrow audience who they could speak more directly to. So it was coming through in that direction. And I think, that's just gained a lot of momentum. And then amongst a younger generation, this idea of minimalism has become a very big mindset, as you had touched on earlier.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, simplification is a way to go, because, this constant changing does not build what we call resilient supply chains. And if you look at organizational resilience today, what we're seeing, and BSI has developed a standard called BS 65000, which is a standard on organizational resilience. And that was backed by governments and institutions and corporations around the world to say, how do we build more resilient organizations? Because if our organizations and our institutions are resilient, well, then our economies are resilient. And we had some work done with Economist Intelligence Unit, and what we found there is that if you look at companies that were on the FTSE 100 or 250 or the Nikkei or the S&P or whatever major stock exchanges around the world, in the 1960s and 70s, companies were on there for around 60 years, right? Now it's around 13 to 15 years.
Oh, really?
So the longevity of the competitive nature of organizations is they're being disrupted quicker now than ever before. And when we looked at the reason why we had shorter lifespans, it came down to things like horizon scanning, anticipating the future, right? supply chain, organizational behavior, culture. It came down to a lot of the soft things that you don't see. And I think what's happened is that this madness of, dividends and change and profit and, low costs has driven these organizations off track. And they haven't invested in horizon scanning, anticipating the future, innovation, looking at their client base, looking at their core, maintaining true to what they do, and then evolving and being good there. And I've seen this in supply chains. I've seen the apparel industry. Some people are churning suppliers, 50% per year.
Really? Wow.
If I look at the food industry where I come from, the churn's down to 10%. And when it's down to 10%, you establish relationships.
Right.
Solve problems. You focus on, working with those people of getting efficiencies. And if you look in China, 20 years ago, the factories were making around 20% margin. Today, it's around 3 or 4. So I'm saying most of our garments either come from cotton, or they come from a textile, or they come from a wool or a mohair or cashmere, the same thing. Now, if we go and tell the world that cheap is best, and at the same time we want regenerative agriculture, we want better topsoil, we want better biodiversity, we want better human rights, we want minimum wages and working wages, we want better animal health, we want better traceability, and we want it at a cheaper price.
Yeah.
Where's your moral compass? Because you can't. Because if a business cannot make money, and our farm numbers are halving, our farmer numbers are halving every 10 years. Most of them only have 30% equity in the bank.
Really?
Most of them have around 40% equity of their properties, which means they owe the banks loans. Right? So they're farming in a way which is not sustainable because they are forced to take shortcuts. They're forced to do practices which are not like regenerative agriculture. So I'm saying if you say price is best, you're not going to get sustainability, you're not going to get resilient supply chains, and you're not going to end up with better topsoil and regenerative agriculture. Because if a farmer can't make a profit, how does he reinvest that back into people, process, product, ecosystem, environment?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think that the purpose of business is to make a profit, enough of a profit to justify doing that business. And yet that's been skewed in the sense that there are some businesses where that profit margin has been driven very, very low, as you've been mentioning, and in other cases where it's, really skyrocketed up. So, maybe what needs to happen is a rebalancing of sorts.
Well, you're seeing that already, Jane. You're seeing that with some of the large retailers and some of the brands. They are actually going down their supply chains, and they're looking at open book, and they understand that, we're in this business. It's think of anything. Exploiting the environment to get something cheap means your business just blows up in a number of years. But if you want a sustainable business which will stand the test of time and be there in 100 years' time, well, then there are no shortcuts.
Right.
Because your supply chain and your partners aren't making money, and they can't invest back into terms of doing the right thing. And we all know what the right thing is because it's just basic human values. We learn that by the age we're 8 years of age, right? And it's about treating people right, and the environment and the ecosystem. And we got science on our side now because we know what's wrong, we know what's right. So let's get on and do it. But integrate that message into your brand, tell the story and the meaning behind it, and build resilient relationships and supply chains. And there's lots of best practice standards out there that demonstrate how to do that.
Absolutely. I think you've made some very important points, and I think that you've brought an interesting perspective to this because of your background and the work that you've been doing for the last 30 years. I'm going to include the website address for your business in the show notes because I think a lot of people will probably want to reach out to you with things that are specific to their own businesses. So if you don't mind, I'm going to put that in there. I thank you so much for taking the time. I know that you're a busy man. We're not traveling these days, but that hasn't slowed anybody down. So thank you.
My absolute pleasure, Jane. It's a pleasure, and it's nice to talk about some of these things and reconnect with my earlier days as an agronomist and animal production specialist, which I really, really sort of enjoyed. But I love this industry, and I think there's huge opportunities ahead for anybody that really wants to tell that story and the meaning behind their brand. Thank you.
What's your biggest supply chain challenge? Please let us know in the comments section. If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, please subscribe to our podcast, where you'll get to hear from some of the industry's leaders and innovators. And if you're looking for an easier way to keep up to date on sourcing shifts, new technology, supply chain strategies, emerging markets, and of course e-commerce, head on over to our website, insidefashionlive.net. and consider subscribing to our weekly newsletters. You'll also find all of our contact information there. Please feel free to contact us with any ideas, suggestions, or questions. That's insidefashionlive.net.